Boy, that's an introduction. It's going to be very hard to live up to. So thank you, Patricia. I want to thank you for bringing me here, and I've so far had a very nice time here in Wichita. Whenever I lecture, it's always a little bit like a travelogue because I do travel all the time. I visit a lot of different places, and for some of you, this is going to be a new thing. I'm going to show what's called a slide show, and the slides are little plastic images that are in cardboard mounts, and they project light through them. So that's what we're going to do here now. And because it is a bit of a travelogue, it's a little bit like seeing your Uncle Milton's slideshow. So I'm going to start you off in the year 1992, and that's an important year for me in terms of the temporal context of this piece, because in 1992 people were thinking a lot about 1492, and that's what I would call the temporal context. We know about site specificity. Site specificity isn't just the city something's in, or the building it's in, or the corner of the building it's in. It's also the zeitgeist, what's happening at the moment. In 1992, I was invited by two small museums in Caracas, Venezuela, to do a project. I had them send me to the remote Amazon territory, the Orinoco Basin, actually, and for a period of 4 weeks. In the museums, I asked them to make 4 empty tables, very simple tables. So it started off in the museum empty. At the end of each week, while I was out traveling with the Proa people, I was collecting a wide variety of materials from the islands and from the places I was visiting. I would pack those into boxes. My dugout would meet a speedboat. The speedboat would take the box, go to Puerto Ayacucho, put it on a truck. It would go to the airport, get flown across to Caracas, another truck, go to the museum. I told the people in the museum, open these crates, and inside you'll find instructions as to what to do with the materials inside, which I want you to display. They opened the crates, no instructions. There were no instructions. They couldn't make sense of it. So they just had a bunch of stuff. They just had this kind of refuse, this natural material. Of course, they were panicked. By the time the second box arrives, they realize, oh yeah, he's tricked us. We're never going to get these instructions. So they resolve that panic. They say, well, wait a minute, we don't need instructions. We're museum professionals. We know that, how to install something. Long things go with long things. Round things go with round things. And so they fell back on their formal training. And so whatever kind of ecological parable or whatever story I had, whatever reason I had for bringing these particular things together became irrelevant to how they used them in the end. So these are some of the kinds of things I would send back. And the last boxes I sent back were boxes of my own equipment. Not so much the things I took from the forest, but the things I took to the forest. So trying to make it clear that in some way the real specimen was myself. Is myself in this garb of the Colonial Explorer, the Colonial Naturalist. That this work has I think, a very complex relationship to performance. It's not a traditional performance where there's an audience and a performer. You have to believe that someone is somewhere out there. And testing faith and testing belief and testing how do we know what we know is a really big part of what my work is about. I'm a person who's very invested in scientific understanding of the world. At the same time, I'm a person who is questioning authority all the time. So how do we know what we know? How do we believe who we're supposed to believe? And those are always things I'm very interested in probing and interrogating throughout this work. A lot of the work very much focusing on the history of the representation of nature, questions of the culture of nature, and these are things I'm continually trying to investigate. This is sort of what the piece actually looked like, and that's the material on the table in the Sala Mendoza in Venezuela. So that last table, many years later, this is the final piece. So I feel like I can rework my projects, my works, my materials, as long as I own them. But at a certain point, hopefully, a museum buys them or they become part of a private collection, and then it's kind of over for me. The piece is solved in a sense. So I reworked this material largely in response to an article in October magazine, which is a very serious art historical journal, which was looking at my generation of artists who were dubbed as institutional critique artists, artists who take on the institution and interrogate it as a site of power, and basically accusing us of becoming institutionalized ourselves, as if this was something that magically happened, as if it's something that we didn't know about, as if it's not part of the game that we're playing. And people like myself and Renee Green, Andrea Fraser, Christian Philip Muller, we're very, very conscious of the way we use institutions and the way institutions use us. So this was a way of trying to very much institutionalize my own practice and make it into a kind of historical fiction as well. So I'm also very conscious of the way not only the artist uses their body and their image, but also the way they use their material to construct or deconstruct mythology, personal mythology in a way. Because my interest is, one of my passions in life is really this, is zoology and particularly tropical ecology, neotropical biology. I try to go out of my way to work with institutions that are not strictly art institutions. I love to work with natural history museums, with scientific organizations, with historical societies. This is a very small natural history museum in Switzerland. And they invited me to do a project. I couldn't say no, but at the same time, while they invited me, I was actually in Brazil working on another project. So I asked them to build a vitrine, a display cabinet, put it in the middle of their collection, and have it empty. And while I was traveling, I would identify vertebrates, birds, mammals, reptiles, fish, amphibians, and everything I could positively identify with field guides and things like that. I would make a list. Some of you probably know I'm obviously a bird watcher, right? A list maker. And so these would go downriver somehow, and they'd end up at a hotel, and they would fax them through to the fax machine at this museum in Switzerland. They would check that list against their enormous inventory. And if they had the animal, they'd put it in the case. So you see in this case, there's a big list, and they only have one thing, the great Kiskadee. So what was interesting to me about this was, the 19th century museum is a little bit like Noah's Ark. You want two good examples of everything. That's the desire of the museum, to be a microcosm. But that's frustrated by a lot of different things. It's frustrated by the fact that maybe Switzerland doesn't have the kind of colonial reach maybe that a British museum had or a French museum had. So they just don't have the clout to get everything. Maybe they show up on the Galapagos and it rains that day, so they get only half the number of specimens they wanted to have. Maybe there's someone in the collection, maybe the entomologist is really interested in crickets but isn't interested in beetles. So the collection begins to get a little warped in the cricket section, right? So there's a subjective nature of the museum that frustrates that kind of Platonic ideal of the museum, to have an example of everything, have two good examples of everything, a male and a female usually. Also, what I liked about this piece is it really is it's a project based on contingency. I don't know if this case was going to be completely full or totally empty. It could have been entirely empty. There's no reason for them to really have a massive neotropical collection. So in this case, there's two birds, a scarlet tanager and I think, what is that? I don't know. And what's interesting for me is that these three slides that I've shown you, that's all I know about this work. I've never seen this work. I made it, and it was done as a project. It existed. It lasted for a certain amount of time, and it came down. And so even my relationship to it is very, on one hand, it's extremely personal because this represents an activity. On the other hand, I never touched it. So it's very impersonal, and there's a lot of contingency based into that. And I'm very interested in that, but not so much in a Cagean way, in this kind of idea of chance, but more in a way that really tests the methodology of the museum, really tests the subjective nature of an objective endeavor. So going back to those boxes I collected, a year or two later, they miraculously arrive in New York. I'm not sure this would happen today, I'm afraid. But so these boxes that are absolutely full of, contraband in a way, this kind of plants and animals and fish, and they become part of a project in which I make 3 fictional bureaucracies. And this was done at American Fine Arts, which was my gallery in New York at the time. So each of these bureaucracies represents an expedition. Each one has a particular methodology, a particular way of going about things, a particular aesthetic. It's almost like they're period pieces in a way. And they have different ways of proceeding. So this one is called the New York State Bureau of Tropical Conservation. But I'm not thinking about conservation like wildlife conservation. I'm thinking about conservation like art conservation. And at this time, or just before this, I worked as a conservator in New York as my get money to go through college kind of job. So every leaf, every twig, every severed butterfly wing, every fish in alcohol comes out of those boxes, is carefully prepared with acid-free paper and glassine in archival boxes and special plastic boxes that don't leach chemicals, and cataloged and placed onto this shelf so that they essentially will be available for all time. They're preserved for all time, but of course, in the process of preserving also means they're invisible. You can't actually see anything anymore. So, and so when you came into this exhibition, you'd find me a much healthier, younger, more handsome me, working at one of these three stations and doing the job of that bureaucracy. Each one had a slightly different costume, and so you'd see me going through these things, not necessarily as the expert, but and when it was done, when I finished the task, and the task of each of the three was very different, the bureaucracy was closed, and what was left was the collection, and each one had a door, which kind of is an indication of the type of bureaucracy it was, in a sense. So this is, you see, the New York State Bureau of Tropical Conservation. So, my job as the artist was to constitute a collection. And then once the collection was done, that's the finished sculpture. As I said, all of these represented an expedition. Not all the expeditions were to remote, exotic places like Venezuela. This was an expedition 4 blocks over to New York City's Chinatown, where for a period of 2 hours, I collected every fresh sea creature I could get my hands on. These were taken to the gallery and put on ice. And this is the apparatus for the project. You might imagine there was a little bit of urgency behind this particular project. And so the methodology here was that, let me go back there. Each creature was taken from the ice using the typical processes that we identify animals, this kind of process called keying out, which is a process of elimination of traits. You go through all the traits of an organism and you eliminate what it could be until you find out really what it is. Once it was identified, it was labeled and preserved and put onto a shelf. Now, this is a hard thing this is hard for people who know what they're doing. So this was exceptionally hard to identify all of these organisms. And it really did take a long time. And to do this, sometimes the distinction between species can be very, very slight. So you really have to work incredibly hard. Some things, of course, you can find right away. Of course, one thing is, one of the clues to help you find out what something is to know where it came from. But China is an international marketplace. I mean, the Chinatown in New York. Things are coming. If you have an octopus, you don't know if that octopus is from the Mediterranean. You don't know if it's from the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the people who you're buying it from usually don't know either. So it's very, very difficult to do this. And you don't see me as the master, as a person, as an imposter ichthyologist. You really see me struggling with this if you come into this event. This is not about taking on the cloak of scientific mastery, which I think you always have to be very suspicious when artists use science and their relationship to science. Science as one of the major power-giving institutions in our culture. To take on that mantle of science always means assuming a certain kind of power, and whether people really deserve it or not. So this is not about an assumption of mastery. Rather, it's about the exact opposite in some cases. It's about a slippage of mastery. And you really see me struggling very hard to realize the Department of Marine Animal Identification of the City of New York, the Chinatown Division. And I did a project some years later, almost a decade later, called the Department of Marine Animal Identification of the City of San Francisco, the Chinatown Division. So that's another thing I'm really interested in trying to do, is to take the same methodology and to try it in a different place. So, we're always learning in art school, so much is about context. Well, how much is about context? We just accept that as a truth, or do we try that out? Do we experiment with that? I think, when someone says something so definitively, that's an invitation to test it. I'm also very inspired by people who I think about as these kind of linchpin figures in the history of natural history. People who really formed our cultural notion of what nature is. So, and you can go back to Aristotle, to George Cuvier, to Darwin, to Alfred Russel Wallace, to Rachel Carson. People who, someone like Rachel Carson, there's nature before Rachel Carson, and then there's nature after Rachel Carson. I'm very interested also not just in people who are working in scientific institutions and universities, but people who make an effort to make their discoveries enter the popular realm. And this is one of those people. This is William Beebe. William Beebe was, I think, for the early part of the 20th century, he was very much what Jacques Cousteau was for the 1970s, or Attenborough was for the 90s, and for now, a great popularizer of natural history, a great popularizer of evolutionary biology. And he believed that if you are studying life, if you are studying biology, the science of life, maybe the basement of the Natural History Museum, looking at insects with pins through them, maybe that's not the best place to do it. Actually, his idea was to take the laboratory out of the basement and bring it to the jungle. So this is British Guiana, I think in 1917, just after the First World War. And he would bring teams of biologists from different fields, also photographers and painters. And they would set up camp and they would investigate the world around them. So very interesting. He was a popular author. He wrote 24 best-selling books. And he was the sort of nature correspondent for New Yorker magazine. So it kind of puts him in a context. He was a very popular social guy. He was a real character in a way. And one of the stories he writes about is called A Yard of Jungle. He's at the mouth of the Amazon. He's about to go home. And he measures out a square meter of leaf litter, and he takes that away. He puts that into a duffel bag, and he brings it to his room in his steamer ship, and he dumps it out on the table, and he spends the entire time going back to New York looking through this. What's in here? What is this stuff? Dividing out the leaves. What kind of leaves? How many different species do we have here? What are these things? Look, there are all these living things in there. They're very, very small. How many different kinds? And, in a way, this is really one of the first indications that biodiversity, this thing we call biodiversity, is really there in the jungle, in the tropical forests. Another great story of his is called My Jungle Table. And these two stories I meshed together for a project that was done in Rio, at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio, during the first of the Earth Summits. So I think this moment where that idea of biodiversity, that thing that we all can throw about, that word enters into popular parlance. I think that it existed as something for specialists, but not for everyone. And now everyone has an idea. But of course, biodiversity isn't about whales and wolves and owls and things like that. It's really about these small things, the microfauna that rule the world in a way. He builds a table in the jungle because he's studying sloths. He's doing some dissections. And as soon as he cuts the animal open, ants climb up the legs of the table and begin eating his specimen, and it's kind of a bad situation. He realizes he can put the legs of the table in coffee cans of water. And he does that. And that keeps the ants out. They can't climb over the water to get on the table. But it also makes the table sprout. So the table begins to grow around him. So it buds. And then, spiders are spinning their web on the table. And then there's wood-boring beetles that are inside the table. And they're knocking to each other. So every time you kind of try to separate something out from, the system kind of comes back and overwhelms him. So I love these two stories. And I reconstructed these. I combined them, reconstructed them in Rio. And there I worked as hard as I could. I took a sample from pretty much the same forest that he did, which is still there in Belém, and brought it to Rio. This is something that you can imagine they have a very lax registrar at this museum, right? They usually don't encourage you to bring things like this in. And so for the first 10 days, I was there also kind of on display as I went through this, separating out all of the forms of life that were inside of this the dead things, the live things, the cultural things, and people were able to come and interrogate this and interrogate me. And the people in Brazil had a very, unlike here, they don't have that kind of religious distance from the artwork. People got involved, sometimes very, very involved. So it would actually be hard to kind of get things done. But nevertheless, it was a very productive piece. And it really led me to a whole series of entomological endeavors, of looking at the history of entomology, looking at people like Johann Henry Faber in France, this kind of great entomologist, and people like, there's a whole slew of really interesting people like Thomas Say. This is in Switzerland, where we measured out a square meter of the Alpine. That's Michel Ritter, the late Michel Ritter, a really great curator who just passed away very recently. We built in his museum a laboratory, and it was a laboratory with very large windows. You could look through and see the specimen we collected, and then also see this other specimen here, who is removing, again, trying to interrogate this, find out who's living in there, taking the specimens over and photographing them with this Zeiss microscope, and resulting in a collection of images. So we started with image number 1 of specimen number 1, and we pretty much went until we broke the photography budget of the museum. And we shot these. I'm always trying to think, how would I do this differently from a scientist? So these are, in some way, very different in the sense that there's no scale to them. So you can't really tell the size of the organisms in relationship to the other organisms, or the placement of the organisms. There are insects, there are arachnids, there are worms, myriapods. The difference is, for instance, this creature is living on this creature. So, they are drastically different scale shifts in these things, and they all have this kind of, I think, very otherworldly-like background to them, which is the result of the minute scratches on the petri dishes that we're photographing these things on. Another project in this vein is called the Great Munich Bug Hunt. We found a linden tree which had been dead about 5 years. We brought that into a gallery right in the center of Munich, a very, what they would call in German, schickimicki gallery. And they're working with a team of people from the graduate students from the Zoological Institute there, graduate entomology students. We did a kind of CSI investigation on this tree. We sort of removed the layers of life, of living organisms from this. A tree like this is really, half of its life begins when it dies. That it's much more productive biologically. A lot of these works also, I mentioned something about the context. Part of the context of this is that a lot of European countries have an extremely hygienic forestry policy. So they don't really have forests very often. They have extensive tree farms. And something like a dead tree is viewed as a very unproductive thing, and it's removed because it breeds wood-eating insects and things like that. So when you walk through a European forest, very often you'll notice how incredibly clear it is, and how the trees very often are of the same size. And you have this cathedral effect, which is very impressive aesthetically, but ecologically is a monoculture, is a disaster, right? And so something like this is really, a dead tree is biologically remarkably productive and interesting, and but it's not industrially very productive, perhaps. So we had also a laboratory there where we prepared our specimens. And then we had a modified butterfly cupboard, which we fixed to contain all of the things that we found. And we didn't limit ourselves just to invertebrates, but also to lichens and molds and algae and fungi and other plants, and even to rocks that had become embedded in the tree itself. So this is just the beginning of the process. So you see there's a lot of things there. So at this point I realized, okay, I've got this methodology. I could be like the insect guy for the rest of my life. But one of the problems is that, I'm always bringing something into the museum, nature into the museum, and maybe it's already there. So with the Smart Museum of Art in Chicago, which is a really interesting museum Museum, which is part of the university. We closed the museum down for a weekend, and with a team of volunteers, as Patricia said, I have some coercive power to work with volunteers. We formed a group that searched for all the living things that were not supposed to be in the museum, starting with the director's office and going down to the storage. And you'd be surprised how many things can accumulate on a Tony Smith sculpture, how many spiders you might find. These were all prepared, again, working with microscope technology, and for the first 5 or 6 days of the exhibition, and then this is the installation that exists as a kind of artifact of that activity afterward. You probably won't be surprised to know that the registrar's office had not a single living thing in it. But the director's office was the absolute, that was really the cornucopia of insect life. Here's my Platonic Ideal. And I do, amongst other things that I enjoy, dressing up is a big part of this kind of activity in a way. Okay, so that's part 1 of 3. This is beginning of part 2. So at this point, I realized that I'm like the natural history guy. Like I'm the zoology artist. So every exhibition about green art and ecology, animals, I'm invited to. And this, I realize, it's cramping my style. I really don't have a lot of opportunities to move anymore. And if you study systems, like I study taxonomies, you realize once you're in a pigeonhole, it's very hard to get out of it. And so I needed a way to move ahead and at the same time throw the hounds off my trail. And to do that, I thought, well, what's really important for me about this isn't so much the precise mechanism of working with zoology, but what's really successful for me was the shadowing of a methodology, to shadow a scientific methodology, to borrow elements of that, to make it work against itself. I thought, okay, well, zoology is certainly not the only science. And so I took on a relationship to something I cared also very much about, something that I was also a dilettante and had a great passion for, which was archaeology. So it started in that town in Fribourg, where I took where I did the natural history, where I did things in the Natural History Museum I built a cupboard where I did the meter of meadow, and where I started my first archaeology project. These houses were built in the 16th century and 17th century. They're built on a precipice that overlooks the river. And since the time that they were built, people have been doing what people do whenever they live up high. They've been dropping things out their window, or things have been falling out their windows. All of this stuff accumulates at the bottom of these buildings, just below the foundations. And because of natural erosion, because of rain and everything else, gravity, all of that material gets turned around. So it doesn't have what archaeologists would call the context, things in stratified layers. It's all mixed up. So Michelle Ritter and I took a couple wheelbarrows and collected as much as we could collect in a day of what was below these buildings. We brought it into the gallery, put it on this tarp, and then throughout the beginnings of the exhibition, I removed all of the man-made artifacts, all of the material culture from this. I built a shelf around the gallery, and after cleaning, cataloging the objects, I placed them on the shelf, not in relationship to what they are, not in relationship to what they're used for, not in relationship to materials, color, just this is the first one I found. This is the second one I found. So creating kind of impression of the simultaneity of history that for me, when I experience, if I go into a town like Fribourg, I look and there's a wonderful 17th century cathedral. There's a beautiful 19th century town hall. There's an 18th century gentleman's house with a new McDonald's in the basement. And that kind of collapsing of history that you sense when you go to a place as old as that. Trying to imagine how to do that in a kind of sculptural form. How to, here we have a 19th century ceramic bit, an early 20th century bottleneck, a very contemporary licorice container, some 18th century stoves, a Dutch stove, and a 19th century heel. So that idea of bringing this stuff together and is really important to me, and also trying to make that sense of history inclusive. So it's not like we're at the pinnacle of history, it's not, but we are rather a point in a continual flow that's gone before us and is going to go along after us. This is the city of Venice. I was invited in 1997 to be part of the Venice Biennale. I was a guest of the Nordic Pavilion. Mariko Mori and I, since we are truly the Nordic ideals, we were invited to come and reflect on them. So this is a city of great art history, of great architecture. It's not, certainly by far not a very old city by Italian standards. As I think most of you probably know, there are no roads in Venice. Rather, you traverse the city through these canals and through the sidewalks. The canals take all the boat traffic. In Venice, as a resident, it's very expensive to do a lot of things because of that. It's expensive to move furniture. It's expensive to throw away your garbage. So if you have a washing machine and it comes to the edge of the canal in the middle of the night and gets pushed a little bit too far, you've solved yourself a big problem. How do I get rid of that broken washing machine? It disappears and no one says anything. So for this reason, and for a number of other reasons, one is that the silt underneath the river is moving very much like the river's moving, just at a quite slower pace. These canals can get clogged up. There can be a lot of hazards for the boat traffic. The city has a fleet of barges that dredge these canals continually. So this is the canal Rio del Senso, which is near the train station, more or less. So this mechanical arm here reaches down, grabs the mud, and puts it into the center. The barges then go out to the lagoon, and they dump it. So I thought, well, what's in this stuff? You hear a lot of stories about the mud in Venice. What's in there? And yes, it's polluted. It's anaerobic. It's full of human waste. But it is also archaeologically very rich. You couldn't stick a pencil in this pudding without hitting something, right? So I took one of the containers from the barges and I set it outside here, outside of the beautiful Scandinavian or Nordic pavilion. This is it. So, and it really is everything it's cracked up to be. It's a very nasty material. And so at the beginning I said, well, what's in here? We're going to go through and remove everything that is inside of this material. So that was the first of a three-part. I saw someone flinch like, yeah, that's what it was like, yeah. And so the first part was actually taking their storage room and turning that into a kind of curiosity cabinet, treasure room. I'm very interested in the way the curiosity cabinet of the Renaissance develops into the Enlightenment Museum that we all know. But before that happens, you have that Renaissance model of the curiosity cabinet. Before that, you have the medieval model of the treasure trove, the treasure room. And in the Middle Ages, everyone has their riches, and their riches are carefully guarded, protected, hidden. And something happens in the Renaissance where people, it's like the invention of bling bling. They understand that, wait, I can take my treasures out and show them to everyone, and then everyone knows that I have fantastic taste, I have power, I have influence, I have global reach. And so, that moment is very interesting for me. So these are my treasures. So instead of gold, I have oxidized iron. Instead of pearls, I have shells. Instead of gems, I have broken green bottles. When I do a project like this, I'm thinking, how can I show this stuff in a way that an archaeology museum would never do? I don't want to tell that story of history. I'm not interested in the evolution of materials. I don't want to tell you the story of the development of technologies. I don't want to tell you the influences of one place to another. I want to show this stuff as though I'm from Mars and I have not a clue as to what this is. I don't want to show it in relationship to any of the kind of narratives that the Archeology Museum would do. I don't want to do that because it would be pointless. There is a place that exists to do that. So I don't want to copy what they do. In the same way that I don't want to use legitimate archaeological sites. I don't want to disrupt. I use sites that are what archaeologists call insignificant and disturbed, which I think is a good subtitle for this whole body of work in a way. But as I said, Venice is not super ancient. It's not. It wasn't a great city during the Roman period, for example. We did find some Roman ceramics. We did find an incredible collection. I mean, there you see medieval ceramics, Renaissance ceramics, very contemporary things, even import ceramics, which is not so common in a place that makes ceramics. So I put all of these things together in this curiosity cabinet. If we have time later, I'll come back and tell you a very funny story of what happened to these things. The third part is always, often I do these projects which have these three parts, and the third part is the studio itself, where you see things in preparation. This was the workroom of the Biennale, which I turned into my laboratory. So you see things that are still embedded in the mud. You see things that are coming out and being partially cleaned. You see things that have been fully cleaned, and they're beginning to break down into categories. So you see things with a wide range of, and I found a lot, I found tons of things. So you see things in this kind of relationship of what's what. This was the worst summer of my life, right? So, despite the fact I had my hepatitis shot, the Nordic Pavilion doesn't really have a lot of money for assistance and glamorous things like that. So literally everything there I found, and I cleaned, and I showed. And so, this was really something for me. So believe it or not, after that, I still wanted to do more archaeology projects. Oh, I'm going to talk about this. This is essentially a sculpture. This exists in a gallery. And this is what I think very often some of those projects that I do are represented only by an artifact afterward. And I think about these sculptures very much as kind of artifacts. They are what's left after the activity it has been done. I can't show you the Venice thing after it's done. That's it. These things carry with it the context. So on one side you have, this is a double-sided cabinet. On one side you have all of the things that went into the making of the piece. You have the materials, and you have things that are also in process. On the other side of the cabinet, you have the collection. So one side is process, one side is the collection. And also there are drawers that you can open in this piece, so you see things. Also, you see the biological collection, which I didn't highlight very much because believe it or not, there are living things in that mud as well. There are a whole ecosystem of mole, shrimp, and sea worms, and polycletes, and really things you probably don't want to know too much about, actually. Oh, what happened there? Huh. Are we missing a slide there? Oh, there it is. So this is the Thames River in London, and this is the site of the Tate Modern, which at this point was not open yet. This is a project I did called the Tate Thames Dig. I worked with a large team of volunteers, and the volunteers were either over 65 or under 17. So teenagers and what the British would call pensioners. And so, and that was really important for me to have these two groups working together. They were mostly from the Bankside area, which is a kind of somewhat dicey neighborhood in those days. The Thames of course, goes through the center of London. It is a very strong river, and it is a very turbid river. It grinds through London in a way. It's tidal, so it comes in and out every day. For each day, for about 4 hours, this area is exposed. This is called the foreshore. The foreshore is insanely archaeologically rich. London really is an old city, and has always been a very wealthy city comparatively. So this is just looking down at any point in the foreshore, and you see perhaps not the best examples, but again, this is a place where the context is destroyed. Things are not in relationship to other things. Especially in some parts of the river, it is true, there is context because they're muddy, and the things just embed themselves in mud on top of each other. In other parts like this, every time the tide goes out, it's like a new roll of the dice. You have a totally different collection of artifacts. The people I worked with, we identified an area, and they were told to collect every cultural object, every man-made thing, every bit of material culture they could find within that. We did 2 hours at this site, which is Bankside. And we did 2 hours at Millbank, which is the other site, which is where the Tate Gallery, what's now called Tate Britain, which then was called the Tate Gallery, is. So they're a couple miles apart. They are worlds apart in terms of their social history, in a way. Not that Millbank was the site where the Tate Gallery is the site of the prison that they used to keep people, debtors' prison, before they sent them off to Australia and New Zealand. So it's also a site with a kind of quite grimy history. This just interesting little note. You see the people who are right on the riverbank. That's actually a coven of witches doing a kind of witch baptism in the middle of the day. One of the things we found out was that there's a lot of magic that still goes on in the river. There were a lot of Hindu people who are doing rituals there almost every day. We found voodoo dolls, and we found magic squares, Islamic squares with this kind of writing on them, and we found lots of messages in bottles that were not always about magic, but often were wishes. These are two people I worked with, who I've worked with on a number of different projects, and they were my project managers. I worked with a really talented group of people. You know, in archaeology, often we talk about having a search image. That's like the thing you have in the back of your head, and that helps you to find things. And you know, this works in paleontology too. This works for people who are collecting shells on the beach. You go with two people. One person will pick out amazing shells. The other person, it's like they're walking in a parking lot. You know, they just don't get it. They don't see it. These two girls had such incredible acumen. They were finding needles and pins from the old, you know, the London Bridge that fell down was the center of the needle, pin, wire, nail trade. And, you know, they would pull out these pins out of there. It's just incredible. This is the team on any particular day. We need to change the carousel. So this is the team. So you see there's a big kind of crew involved in this project. What was interesting to me was the idea of having the pensioners and the teens. The teenagers had this idea of the olden days. And the olden days was everything from the Beatles to the Romans, you know. And so they would get very excited. They would say, oh, I found something from the olden days. And they would bring it up. And then one of the pensioners would take this and say, well, that's not from the olden days. That's a bottle from Peck's fish paste. And, you know, we used to get that in the Second World War when we needed to go underground. You would get these little care packages, and we always had Peck's fish paste in them. So that idea of making history real, not as history as something out there, but something that is part of your life. And, you know, you need to. For me, the only way these archaeology projects work is if you see yourself in them. And so that was a way I wanted the whole thing to function. On the lawn of the Tate, we built these kind of Indiana Jones style tents. There was a tent for all of the things from Millbank and all of the things from Bankside. And we worked there, everything we found, and I say easily without exaggeration, we found tens of thousands of things because we collected everything. We did a week at each site with about 20 people working 2 hours a day. So that's a lot of stuff you can accumulate. Everything had to come out of the tent and get cleaned and categorized. So we created this kind of barrier, and we said, you know, anyone but an obvious lunatic can come behind the barrier and look through the tents, and, you know, occasionally lunatics get through, but it's, yeah. People tended to treat us a little bit like the Antiques Roadshow, you know. But anyway, we allowed people to kind of snoop through. And as I said, we found an astonishing amount of things. Bankside and Millbank are different. You know, Bankside has always been the place, even going back to the Elizabethan times, that was a bit rougher. You know, in the Elizabethan times, the things you couldn't do in the city, the slaughterhouses, vinegar factories, the whoring, drinking, theater, bear baiting, all of these kind of dubious things were done on Bankside. And so this is part of that. These are, as I said, I told them to collect all man-made things. These are actually all bones, but you know. But this is a small sample of some of the objects, of some of the bones we found. Sometimes it's hard to get teenagers to wash dishes, and my volunteers did a very good job all summer long. There they are. And we went through this process of kind of always refining our collection. So first we just had a mountain of glass, and then we began to divide the glass: clear glass, brown glass, green glass, glass with writing on it, glass with no writing on it, whole bottles, broken bottles. And so, continually getting a sense of what we had. Then I designed a very large display case based on 18th century visual cabinets, visual cupboards. It's, again, a double-sided case. So one side contains everything from Millbank. One side contains everything from Bankside. And when I say everything, I mean everything. This has 99% of what we found. There's a shopping cart, a dead dog, and a bicycle that didn't make the cut. But otherwise, it's all in here. And so, it is densely packed. Yeah. And you would think, of course, because it is a double-sided cupboard, you would be able to compare. That's seems like the idea for doing a double-sided thing, that you would, and it seems an idea that you have two sites, you want to have a comparison between the two sites, so you can come up with some conclusions about the social history of the two sites. Guess what? You can't do that, because I don't show the same things on both sides. So there's no real way of actually comparing what you see. So the displays on this side are very different from the displays on the other side. So in this case, I'm showing things that are, I'm not showing you everything because I can't really show you everything. I can't show you all the bloody credit cards we found. I can't show you all the human teeth we found. I can't show you all the cell phones we found, buttons we found. There's just too much stuff. And so it has an interactive element as well. There are drawers that you can pull out. And all the drawers are arranged they have very specific kinds of arrangements and very specific kind of things. But you can't figure out a system because each drawer has a different system. So one drawer may be plastic bottle caps arranged in the color spectrum. The next drawer might be nails and keys. The next drawer will have a totally different system. It might be ceramic. So it might be different things will be shown based on material, based on use, based on color, based on size, based on a whole variety of things, but always changing. So always destabilizing, always showing you that I'm showing you one thing, but I could easily show you something else. And so this is kind of our greatest hits cupboard. So, we have, a wedding ring and a voodoo doll and a sea urchin test, a fossil, from 400 million year old fossil. That kind of is good when people ask you, what's the oldest thing you found? 400 million year old fossil. 16th century ceramics, the needles and pins, teeth from the bears, from bear baiting, bullets from the Second World War, children's shoes. Yeah, that kind of stuff. This next one is all oxidized locks, keys, nails, screws, things like that. The last element, of course, are the photographs of all of the people who worked on the project. So not just the volunteers, but also the Tate publicity staff and the curators and the people who really helped us to negotiate the thing as well. So that's the end of part 2. We're coming to the home stretch, so keep your seats. The third group of work I'm going to show you are our outdoor projects, our public art projects in a way. And as much as, I'm very interested in working in the public realm, and when I work in a gallery and a museum, I know a lot about the people who are going to come see my work. And I'm very interested in working in a realm where I don't necessarily know those people. I like working in the public realm. But I also think public art just can be so terrible. I mean, it really can be the realm of art that fails the most. And when I think about what's successful in public art, I think, okay, cemeteries, that works. And follies, this sort of 18th and 19th century buildings, this kind of architecture that, in some way, it's architecture that is not meant to have a practical function, but rather to have a discursive function. It's architecture that is meant to make meaning and to create situations. So that was very inspiring for me in some way. This is the beginnings of these projects, which is this is called the Schoharie Creek Field Station. And I'm very interested in the idea of field station, these places that scientists use to help them negotiate the world around them, the difficult, sometimes difficult place. This one's on the Schoharie Creek in upstate New York, and It is built in the kind of Catskills vernacular. It's adaptive reuse of a structure that existed, modified. The way one would experience this piece is you would write the arts organization, and they would send you a key. You can go up there and open the building up, and you could spend a day, an hour, 2 days, a week inside this building. So it is an installation that is meant to be interacted with in a sense. And it's filled with things representative of the study of natural history and the history of that, but also with contemporary things. There's contemporary microscopes, contemporary things to do dissolved oxygen tests and to sample the creek right behind there. There's a little cooking place that says you can cook your supper there. There's a bed that suggests maybe you don't stay too long, right? And then, of course, there's lots of details. The pictures on the wall, that's not, it's not grandpa, great-grandpa in the back, it's actually Darwin. And that the fat guy smiling and fishing is not just a fat guy smiling and fishing, it's actually Ernest Hemingway smiling and fishing. And there's pictures of Fly Reel Crosby, the woman who sort of popularized fly fishing. So it's all of these elements kind of accumulate, and I know that they also, this is a tricky piece because you know that there might be some level of degradation in it. So I'm always, after doing a lot of installation, trying to think how can I take things to the next step and have people interact, but how to do that without having them destroy, it's tricky. I'm still working on that question. So I was invited to do increasingly more kind of public art things. This is actually in Germany, on the border of Germany and the Netherlands. This is a very small area. It's a small bog, about 40 acres, but it's the only example of this kind of bog that exists in Europe. It's the last kind of example of this preserved special habitat. They wanted me to make a gateway to the nature preserve, and I built these two structures, and you enter the preserve between the two structures. So one is a traditional Jägerhütte, a hunter's house. All my work starts with these very kind of generalized, cartoony, hokey drawings, and they expand from there. I make drawings that are very generalized that allow the people who I'm working with, since I rarely get to make my own work anymore, to interpret things and to build them in their vernacular, to really try to use the best I can from the people I'm working with. So this is the building, again, built as a ruin. A great idea for public art is to start with a ruin, because the ruin is the only thing that gets better as it gets worse. So, you can graffiti this, you can light it on fire, it's just going to get better and better. So it's a real way to work out the vandalism issue, which is a very big issue in public art. So also, working with vernacular architecture, working with these diminutive structures has given me a way to work in the public realm and still to maintain my interest in working in installation, because the building is a vitrine, right? And so you experience the piece by looking through the windows. And you look through the windows, and one of the disadvantages of seeing this piece is, of course, you're seeing it like the day it was done. So, of course, now it's overgrown, and there are plants coming up through the building, and it's much more moss-covered. So the inside is the construction of the character, this hunter who has his objects around him, his life, his bed, his stove, his trophies. Everything is there, but everything is a little bit off. I like to try to reward my careful viewers. So people who look carefully can see that the photographs of hunters, these aren't hunters, these are actually Hollywood celebrities. So there's Kirk Douglas and the cheetah he shot when he was in Africa and things like that. And that's also true for the second. Its companion building is the contemporary biological field station. So trying to use two different models of a way of understanding the natural world. And this also is built in the local style, but contemporary. It's built this way because it rains there all the time, and if you can hide under this roof if you get caught in a downpour, as I did every time I visited. And again, you experience the piece by looking through the windows. The piece is the building, and the piece houses the work as well. So you look through, and there you see everything you would need to study this environment, to take care of it, to observe it. But there are clues that this is maybe not what you think it is. So there's sinks without water. There's sinks without spigots, and there's computers and and phones without lines, or there's enough there to kind of make you feel, to make a visitor feel like this maybe isn't what it seems to be. I have some friends who run a gallery in Germany called the Gallery für Landschaftskunst, for landscape art, and they're devoted to working with young artists who are dedicated to rethinking the landscape genre. And so they were very critical of my field station. They said, why don't you just make a real field station? Why does it have to be, why is it always fake? Why can't you just make something real that works? I said, okay, let's do that. So we went to the city of Hamburg. We convinced them to lend us a barge. We built a structure on the barge. And Hamburg, they're very proud to say, Hamburg is a city that has as many canals, or if more canals, than Venice. And so we built this barge, we constructed this and moored this in several different places along these canals. And we created a biological field station, a building that could be used to investigate the canals of Hamburg, its inhabitants, and was used. It was used as a platform for soil scientists, for botanists, but also we said, why stop there? Why don't we can let anyone use it? We can, So we did art for nature illustration classes for kids on the weekends. We had people who, this is it in another location. This is it on the Ulster. So it was set up for a variety of different uses. And anyone could come to us. As the local scuba diving club said they wanted to use it for a platform. We said, no problem. We like that word, actually, platform. That's what it was. There was this woman who was adamant about reading the Odyssey overnight by firelight. And so we let her use it. We basically said anything but a rave, And so a lot of artists used it to make projects, and we used it as an exhibition space. And it just did have this kind of incredible flexibility to it. And we used it as a fishing platform. There's actually a lot of perch in these canals. So it was just a kind of fantastic site. It was a site that really allowed a lot of opportunities. And now it's been taken over by the next generation of artists from the Gallery für Landschaftskunst, who actually has built another level on this. So they keep my level as it is. And then they built this museum of the 60s, which is a kind of museum of activism and psychedelia. And so, I don't know. I think you're probably topping out at 2 levels. I don't know how much more they could get on this thing, but... This project is going to take a little bit of explaining. This is at the Tijuana estuary nature preserve, which is on the border of the United States and Mexico. It's on the American side, so it's kind of, it's in San Diego, basically. Right next to this on the beach is the Imperial Beach development, a giant, sprawling, massive houses right on the Pacific Ocean. The Tijuana River enters the ocean here, and the Tijuana River is drastically polluted. It gets a lot of household pollutions from Mexico, and then gets a lot of industrial pollutions from California, empties into the ocean. If you went to another side, you would find this sprawling Californian suburb. I mean, just incredible sprawl. Next to that, we have where the Navy tests their helicopters. So you can't actually be in this nature preserve without 4 or 5 helicopters above, Navy SEALs dangling from them. On the other side, of course, is Mexico. So you have the wall, and you have the border patrols constantly. You have kids there with their dirt bikes from the suburban housing projects. You have bird watchers. It's not exactly a restful nature reserve, And it was built on a landfill. That's what saved this place from being developed. And then it was used by the Navy to practice bombardment and stuff like that during the Second World War. So this is the landscape of mischief, right? This is really a landscape that it has had a lot of problems. So I built a structure which I think has the kind of vernacular of mischief. It's built on a beautiful flooded bomb crater. And how you see this piece is you go to the Parks Department, you give them your ID, they give you a key. You hike out 3 miles, which means none of my friends from New York have ever seen this piece. And you open the door, and instead of mischief, what you find is a mecca for bird watchers, a building that is entirely dedicated to people who love birds, to birders. There's the list of all the birds that have ever been seen at this place. There's your likelihood of seeing them at a particular season. There are the silhouettes of the raptors above. There are books about the birds. There are binoculars, spotting scopes. There's raincoats. There's recording equipment. There is watercolor paper and paint. Anything you might want to actually activate this space. And there's no monitoring. You just go there, and if you want to steal everything, you can. But no one did. And it was up for 3 or 4 months, and no one touched it. No one destroyed, no one stole. It's all there. Oh, that's interesting. We won't be doing a PowerPoint today. Here you see at the top, you can see there's some pictures of the 40 resident birds, which are instead of actual, they look like the kind of triumph of nature photography, but they're actually dead birds. They're birds from natural history museums. Here's a kind of a Hall of Fame for birders. There's Roger Torrey Peterson, Rachel Carson, people, William Conway, people who have done a lot for birds. There's some x-rays for birds who have run into some problems with people, literally in some cases. There's a chart in case you want to build a bird. So the Public Art Fund in New York was very jealous of that work. They really wanted that work. So we put it on a truck, we moved it across the country, and we installed it in Madison Square Park, which is the park on 23rd Street near the Flatiron Building, which has the biodiversity of one of your parking lots out here. And we created the Urban Wildlife Unit. And to do this, I found a friend of mine who's a respectably well-known DJ, and probably is the person I know who knows the least about the natural world. So he maintained this facility, and again, there are many of the same things, but this time switching very much to urban wildlife, what you can see in New York City, which sometimes is surprising. In this particular park, maybe less surprising than some other places. And so people could come up and as much as it maybe looks like a hot dog stand, it actually is a kind of clearinghouse of information, and you'd be encouraged to come in and browse. And while Sean couldn't tell you anything, he could kind of point you in the direction where you might actually find something out yourself. And just to help him along, we also developed this field guide, which you could take away. And this had entries like grass and dogs and roaches and things like that. So, and there were some surprises. There's a very, very mature stand of elm trees, which are pretty much extinct as a species in a way, that exist within this park because they're so isolated. They've avoided the Dutch elm disease. So, okay, we're winding down here. So hold on with me. Come on, you can do it. So this is a project called originally called the Seattle Vivarium. It's in the center of the city of Seattle. In Seattle, there was an area that was a petroleum transfer station. This was taken away. Everyone thought this area was so polluted, you could never build on it. So none of the developers touched it. And Seattle is really a town for developers. The Seattle Art Museum went in, they secretly tested the soil. They found out it's not as bad as we thought. They lined up their ducks at City Hall, bought this place, and made, I think, it has to be the first significant urban sculpture park. I mean, it is just an extraordinary place. It's right in the center of the city, and it really preserves an area of green space downtown which didn't exist at all. They had a number of new projects that they supported, including mine, and I'm extremely excited about that. My project is a very large purpose-built greenhouse which contains a hemlock tree, an old-growth hemlock, a dead tree that died about 2 years before I got my hands on it. It is about 160 years old. What we know about this, I've worked a lot with biologists, with foresters, with engineers, architects. This was an incredibly collaborative project in a way. This, as I said, this tree is about 160 years old. The foresters tell me that with a tree like this, it takes about as long for one of these trees to decay as it does for them to grow. So this is going to be here for a while, I hope. And I was really interested in Seattle. I'm someone who likes to go out and hike and go to forests. The forests in the Pacific Northwest are so radically different. You really are, none of the forests that we see are really our primary forests. We're looking at forests that in New England have been cut at least once, usually twice. So you're not really seeing what a forest would have looked like. And here you see forests, you feel forests that are very different. You see how the forest is built on layers of the forest. And when you're walking through these forests, you feel like you are walking on trees, on top of trees, on top of trees, which is exactly what you are doing. Because it's a rainforest, there's not a lot of nutrients there. Everything is leached out through the rain. So all the nutrients in a forest like this are really bound up in the vegetation, bound up in these trees. When a tree like that falls, those nutrients are released to the next generation of forest. The next generation of forest begins to build right on top of that. These are called nursling logs, right? These nurse logs, and this is a big root wad. It took me about more than 2 years to actually find the right candidate tree. We knew what kind of species we wanted. We knew what the size we wanted. It's not easy to find that. It's not easy to find that in an accessible place. And the amount of log we wanted is too heavy to helicopter out, so we really had to find something. We couldn't take it from the national forest. The guy said, the paperwork to get this tree out of the forest will stretch from here to DC and back. So it's not good. But the watersheds, which preserve enormous amounts of land outside of Seattle, have particular kinds of rules. And part of their rules involve having some kind of educational component, which some of them do have, some of them don't. This tree became part of the educational component for one of them. So this tree fell down. We know the storm it fell down in February, and 2 years before we took it out. It fell quite close to the road, and we brought it into the center of the city. You can see this is something that obviously Seattle's not an old city at all. 100 years ago, this wouldn't have been hard to find in the middle of the city. This is the building we built around it. So we built a purpose-built greenhouse. Everything in this greenhouse is about trying to maintain this tree in its, allowing it to do what it would do in the forest. And in other words, it's on life support. This is not a cheerful environmental piece. This is a very sad, this is a very melancholy piece. You enter through this atrium. You see there's a frieze of naturalists. Again, some of these people I was talking about who I think are great popularizers. Hazel Wolf, who's a local entobiologist, John Muir, of course, William Beebe, who we spoke about. And so this is it. This is the final piece. So the ceiling, the roof is this very acidic green. This green, we worked with lighting engineers. We sampled the lights from under the forest canopy. This has the same spectrum of that forest. So that's what the green is for. The building really breathes with you because the building is maintaining. This is a forest that's very studied. So we know what the temperature should be at a particular time of year. We know what the humidity should be. There's a lot of energy that goes into supporting this thing. When it gets too hot, the building opens up, the shutters open up, the blinds come down. This all happens automatically. So while you're in here, you feel a little bit like you're in the belly of an organism. Instead of hiding away all that structure, which we easily could have done, we really foreground it. So we have the passive cooling systems. It recycles all the rainwater from the roof. So we have these two massive tanks that contain that rainwater. That's used in irrigating the tree. There's sprinklers that come on. So the more time you're in there, the more you see of these automated systems that are taking a lot of energy to do what nature does all the time, pretty much for free. It's meant to look a little bit like a mortuary, but also like a studio and like a classroom and like it looks a little bit like the art school actually. And it has that kind of polished roof. There are educational tools here. There are carts that are used by educators to talk about the tree. The tree can be talked about from a wide variety of perspectives, from people talking about land art to people talking about biology. It functions. It works so far. So there are also in the forest where this came from. There are large tarps which are collecting the forest dander. So they bring in twice a year. They harvest these and throw onto the tree all of the mold spores, fungus spores. All of the kinds of things that one of the things we have here is a tree that's meant, but we don't have the forest. So we need to supplement that. So we also bring in insects, logs filled with ants and things like this. Everything is kind of breaking down this tree. What interested me about Seattle when I was there is that people didn't take me, when I arrived there, people didn't take me to see the giant cauldron that they have. They didn't take me to see the public art that they have around the city. They didn't take me to see the collections. They took me to see the salmon ladder. And the salmon ladder is this window that's cut into the river, and when the salmon swim upstream, you can see them. And it's brilliant. And people love to go there. They love to bring their children there. Their children grow up and they love to bring their children there. And that's really the model I was thinking of for this. I was thinking about this as something people can follow for 50 or 60 years and say, oh yeah, there's that neat thing that's down there. You've got to go see that. And it will change. It changes every day. It changes every hour. And so that idea of looking at nature, not as a thing, but as process, is really what made this make sense for Seattle. And there you can see that it's on a very busy street. You see behind it is Roxy Payne's tree. In front of it is this Michael Heitzer. Behind there is the Space Needle. I love that it's on the street corner. So, truckers can come and look out the window. Oh, how's the tree doing? And of course, for me, a big part of it is being in the building. It's built with a kind of forced perspective. It's built with this kind of. I saw these very funny games that Bernini played in Rome, where you see these very strange perspective games. And it's built like that. You walk in there and you feel a little bit like Alice through the rabbit hole. The perspective kind of makes it difficult for you to kind of know exactly what you're doing and the scale of things. So it's built to kind of include those references. And of course, the minute you step into this place, the texture of the air is very different. The smell is very different. And that this is something that really does magnify all of the senses rather than exclusively the visual. But nevertheless, you can see it quite well from outside. You don't actually have to go in the building. But for me, the real experience is to be inside. Okay, we're coming down to the wire. This is a piece I'm just bringing in because I think it's quite a fun piece. And this was done at the University of Manchester. The University of Manchester has a Department of Art History and Archeology. There are several scholars there, an Australian scholar, a French scholar, and a British scholar, who had a personal affinity and interest in the history of surrealism. And Britain doesn't have a huge, it's not really what we think about as a hotbed of surrealism, but it does have a significant contribution there. They applied to lottery funding to have a center for the study of surrealism. And much to their surprise, as everyone else's, they were funded at the highest possible level. So in Britain, whenever something happens, you have to have an artist in residence. If someone's like chewing gum, you need an artist in residence. It's really kind of this extraordinary thing, which I'm not knocking. And so the university, between the Manchester Museum, which is a natural history, archaeology, and ethnography museum, and the Bureau of Surrealism invited me to come there. I found myself in a cinder block building, standing in front of a door that said Center for the Study of Surrealism. And you think, wow, what's behind this door? And can't you just imagine how cool that would be? And of course, I opened it up, and it's, a couple of folks in front of a computer, and, it's not really what I hoped for. At the same time, I couldn't help but notice how, while the Manchester Museum had gone through this elaborate process of spending a fortune to make itself a far less interesting museum than they started. They spent millions of pounds ruining themselves and making themselves a very boring kind of museum. And while I was going throughout the university is a great old university with the most noble of histories, and I would pass dumpster after dumpster of that history as they were throwing away their mahogany paneling, their furniture, their wonderful student wooden desks so they could be replaced with nice Formica desks, ripping out their old lecture halls so they could build lecture halls like this. And so, all of this, I had no real intention of making a nostalgic piece, but I couldn't help myself in a way. So I created this thing which is called the Bureau of the Center of Surrealism and Its Legacy. The Surrealists actually had an office. They did have a bureau in the 1920s, and they did researches. Yeah, you can imagine what that is. So this is a room that most people experience through those glass partitions, which were also pulled out of a dumpster. And you enter through. The public is not generally allowed to enter, although you can specially request. But you can see everything from the outside. And the museum, the Manchester Museum, I went through the collections. This was about a 2-year process, and selected a lot of the things that no longer kind of fit into the contemporary museology. Sometimes I worked with all of the curators within the museum. Some of the curators would say, I can't give you anything, like the Egyptian curator. I can't give you anything from my collection. It's priceless. These are Egyptian artifacts. I said, okay, just give me your fakes and forgeries. And they open the door, and it's just filled with fakes and forgeries. These you can have, and it doesn't really matter to me. So, Manchester's a great city with a great history. We researched traditional linoleum. We've got to put in a linoleum floor. I printed a wallpaper, which you can, there's a better picture of it later, based on Manchester designs. I worked with some students who researched and found these incredible designs. I worked with things that are, the Surrealists were very interested in things that were obsolete, things that had just passed in a way. So these are, in this cupboard you see some educational models. These are wax models of they're kind of botanical models. No one teaching botany would ever use these things now, but they are extraordinary things of wax and paper mache. There's a platypus and the desk and the clock from the director's desk. He wasn't always so happy with that. So there's a lot of extraordinary things of great curiosity, beauty, ugliness, terror, freaks, forgeries, all the things that were. There's a telephone. We printed cards, and we also sent out. The Surrealists had what they called the papillons, these small cards and things that they sent out to people, and questionnaires, and they hoped people would respond. So we printed those as well. We always gave the number of the bureau. So the phone is connected to an answering machine. People can call the bureau and leave messages for the bureau, and no one will ever call them back. But you can have this quite funny experience of being in the room while someone's calling. And so, and it really does look like someone just left. Here you can see the element of the wallpaper. It is 8 of the official 10 Rorschach test designs, surrounded by these Manchester colors, and then in the corners here we have the monographs of some of the Surrealists as well. So and Dadists, so we have Kurt Schwitters and André Breton, and you see somewhere Marcel Duchamp's Rose c'est la vie and things like that as well. There's a 6-legged gerbil. Is that a gerbil? Yeah. Yeah. You don't see that every day. So, it's great to go through the museum and find those. Okay, this is absolutely the last thing. So a lot of the work I've shown you are projects that are in some way related to museums and institutions. I've shown very few gallery things. This is also not really a gallery thing, but this is one of the ways I support myself, of course, is to sell my work to collectors. And this is a project I did for a collector who bought a piece that didn't exist. So it was a piece that I made in a museum, borrowing the museum's things, and she came in and said, I must have it. This is great. I love it. This is your best piece. Here's your check. And gave it to me. And I was like, okay, we'll talk about it later. And so, of course, she didn't have a work in the end. I said, don't worry. So I said, I'm going to send you some packages. So they're going to be from all over the world, and you will open them at the turn of the century. Now that seemed like, that was in 1993. That seemed impossibly far away. So wherever I went, I started to send her packages. And I sent her a lot of packages from a lot of different places. And the turn of the century was coming, and she called me and said, are you coming? I said, no. I said, well, can I open the package? I said, no, sorry about that. And so it just kind of formed into this project. And I finally, after we accumulated a certain number of packages, I built this cupboard to kind of house them. So, and today I sent some packages from here that we're going to Sydney, Australia, in a piece very similar to this that I'm doing with the Museum of New South Wales. So that's all, folks.